Hello, I'm Robin and welcome to Multi-Music Technology. Today we're looking at the best synthesizers. That kind of thing. The best synthesizers. This video is essentially an extension of the work I do over at careersinmusic.com, where I write and have been writing for many years, many best of articles. It's an interesting job and I put in loads and loads of time in trying to gather together the best information that I possibly can based on what other people think, other reviews, what I think, my opinion, sales, pricing, features, all those sorts of things I bring together, boil them down and try to work out what I feel is really pushing the boundaries at this time. Now, we have a shed load of synthesizers out there and choosing the best of is in many ways a ridiculous notion. But hey, I have come to believe that it's a useful thing to do, that people, when they are looking to purchase a new synthesizer, benefit from people's opinions on that. And we all tend to search for the best of this, that and the other, the best air fryer, the best hair dryer, whatever it is that you're looking for. We tend to search for those things on the internet. And so I hope that this video will bring some sense of clarity and reasoning behind the synthesizers that I've chosen on this list to help you decide between various synthesizers. That's the plan. Anyway. So for this list of impossible things to choose between, for an impossible list of impossible stuff, I've decided to categorize it a little bit. What I've been looking for is synthesizers that really, I think, bring something new and exciting and interesting to the market as it stands right now. If you're looking for like the best beginner synth or the best synth for under 500 quid, this is not really the list for that, and I will do other videos on those sorts of things. But if you're looking for, what synthesizer should I buy as my first one, you're probably looking at something like the Korg Minilog, maybe the Novation Bass Station, or any synthesizer from Behringer. Which perhaps is worth mentioning first of all is that I haven't actually gone for any Behringer synths in this list. The reason for that is that the vast majority of them are remakes or clones of earlier synthesizers. And while that's marvellous and fantastic and really good value for money, it doesn't really bring or add anything new or exciting to the genre of the synthesizer. Similarly, you can also buy enormous synthesizers, things like the Yamaha Motif or Korg Kronos, that are packed full of every sort of synthesis into one big workstation machine. Again, for me, that's not really the nature of a synthesizer. Synthesizer, for me, wants to be a musical instrument, not something that is everything to all people, but something which works as an instrument, something that you can program and play with and patch and enjoy and explore as an instrument in of itself, as opposed to trying to be 15 other things at once. So those are my very loose and completely inconsistent sort of guidelines. So without further ado, let's get into it. This first one is a brand new one, the Moog Muse. Probably the most exciting synthesizer I've seen in quite some time, actually. The reason for that is because it just encompasses everything that I personally like, and this is my list, after all, everything I like about synthesizers. It's big, it's chunky, it's covered in interesting knobs and sliders, it has lots of throwbacks to retro looks and retro controls of other old ancient synths from way back. It has an aesthetic quality and physical presence which really would make it the centerpiece of any studio. And then, heck, there's the sound. 8 voices of polyphonic analog gorgeousness that just pours out of this thing. Now, Moog released the Moog 1 a few years ago. I remember playing on one when it first came out and thinking that this is an extraordinary synthesizer. The Moog 1 was, if you like, the evolution of the memory Moog, the original polyphonic analog synthesizer. And it brought with it perhaps a lot of expertise, but also a lot of baggage, a lot of a sense of being high-end and professional, and so therefore kind of difficult to get into. You felt like you had to have a degree in synthesis just to really get the best out of it, and it would only really reward those adventurers who journeyed far enough and deep enough into the bowels of the synth. With a Moog Muse, don't feel that at all. It feels instant, straight, right there. All the controls laid out. Bam, put your fingers down and it just oozes out this gorgeousness of sound, of analog tones sweeping about the place. Everything on the front panel is as you expect it to be. You've got your oscillators, your filters, your envelopes, everything is laid out in the way in which you expect a synthesizer to work. And then all of those parts are pulled from Moog's heritage. There's stuff from Moog Modular brought into there. There's stuff from older synths brought into there to give you this character, this level of vintage sound that I think only Moog can capture. Each voice uses 2 analog VCOs, plus a third one for modulation. And from there it travels through 2 voltage-controlled ladder filters, the classic Moog ladder filter, before ending up in a stereo VCA. So you've got a big stereo sound with stereo filtering on every single voice. There's only 2 LFOs, sadly. There could have been more. You could have thought, well, maybe some more, but then that third VCO is also taking over some of that stuff. But anyway, from the LFO point of view, you've got one general use one and then another one that's dedicated to pitch wobbling, to give it that bit of tremolo. Vibrato maybe, is that what I mean? And then you have a pair of envelopes, one for the VCA, one for the VCF, but the envelopes are also loopable, which brings in more low frequency oscillation. So the modulation is quite intense. 16 slot matrix for assigning sources to destinations to get a lot of movement going on. But what's interesting perhaps is that everything is doubled up because it's by timbral. You can run 2 voices at the same time, stacked, top of one another, layered, or split across your keyboard. It also has quite an interesting sequencer which goes much further than most sequencers do. It has automation lanes. I think up to 8 parameters can be recorded per step, and you can also introduce probability in not just what's happening and what's firing, but in which sequence and notes it's traveling to and from. So there's a lot of creative ideas, a lot of not necessarily innovation, just the pushing of ideas, of rather than having something which is just standardly ticking all the boxes, it's starting to push out from those boxes into finding new and interesting and creative ways to inspire you as you're playing that instrument. I think the Moog is just a beautiful synthesizer. It's a great example of how a fabulous synthesizer company that has been through its own trials and problems of late can still produce something which really hooks into what we love about synthesis. It hooks into all of the aspects, the beauty of it, the aesthetic of it, the workflow, the interface, the sound, the innovation and the potential for making cool stuff, awesome sounds, just on that synthesizer alone. It's a fantastic thing. When it first came out, when I first saw it, or rather when it first leaked, because it had quite a few leaks before it actually got officially announced, I thought that perhaps this was going to be the synthesizer for the people. I thought it was going to be priced at a point which would make most people go, yes, must, absolutely have that, that's fantastic. Sadly not. With Moog, often you get a premium price tag, and this is no exception. And so while it's nowhere near as expensive as the Moog 1, which seemed like an otherworldly synthesizer for other people, it's still a meaty chunk of investment. But hey, if you have a few £1,000s knocking around, then what better to sink it on than the fabulous Moog Muse. Sequential, of course, are another classic vintage company of synthesizer makers. They make extraordinary synthesizers, as we saw with the original Prophet 5 and the relatively recent Rev 4 revision reissue of the Prophet 5 and Prophet 10. Fantastic, classic, vintage synthesizers that you can't help but adore. But that's not what I'm interested in for this list. What I'm interested in is one of their more recent synthesizers. It's called, rather disappointingly, the Take 5. See, Take 5 is not a great name. Take 5 isn't that some kind of elevator music tune or something else? It's like a bad boy band or something like that. Take 5. I mean, it's referring to 5-voice polyphony, which like the Prophet 5 had. But Prophet 5, that's a great name. Take 5, not so much. But if we get over the naming of it, and get into the synthesizer as it is, I think you'll find that this is something a little bit special. Now what you immediately notice is that it's actually quite compact. It's only actually 44 keys, it's light, relatively portable, which actually makes it very, very suited for live performance. And honestly, who can fit all of these enormous synthesizers into your studio? Can you? I mean, do you just have walls and walls and racks of these things? I mean, you perhaps need something which will actually sit on your desk. And the Sequential Take 5 will do that. But it's also got to be able to sound fantastic. And fortunately, thank you Cockerel, it does. 2 oscillators, again, going through a nice big fat filter, a nice big fat filter knob in the middle. It's really designed for people who like to focus themselves into the sound crafting space. The filter actually comes directly from the new revision of the Prophet 5. Everything else around it is digital. It's actually a hybrid synthesizer. Now, the late great Dave Smith had a hand in designing this one. This is the last synthesizer that he designed, and he's very much about the hybrid workflow. It's very much about digital and analog, taking the awesome, gorgeous sounds of analog VCOs, perhaps an analog filter, and running that through an analog signal chain, but have it all controlled by digital microprocessors. And that's what we find here, which is great at keeping the cost down, keeping it compact, and keeping the whole thing working perfectly together. And actually, Moog have done something very similar with the Muse, in that all the control systems around everything are digital, and that keeps everything just together beautifully. So the digital modulation engine features a pair of LFOs and a pair of envelopes. You've got one LFO that's global for the whole thing and one LFO that works per voice. The 2 envelopes are run to the VCA and the VCF, as you would expect, but you can also uncouple one of them to run other things and then use the other one to dual itself into both the VCA and the VCF. So there's some interesting levels of versatility coming out from the modulation engine. You also have the ability to delay the modulators, so it comes in after you've been playing it, which is something that personally I really like. Be able to play a note and it plays purely, and then it starts to modulate down the line. And then there's a simple 64-step sequencer, an arpeggiator, and all the little bits and pieces that make for a decent synthesizer. Now, the Take 5 is not something that's going to revolutionize your workflow or take you to places you've never been before. I think the beauty of the Take 5 is its instant accessibility, because it's laid out exactly how you want a synthesizer to be. It has everything where it needs to be. It's going to be in tune. It's going to work properly because of all the digital shenanigans going on in the background. You're not having to worry about things drifting or getting out of sorts. It's the sort of synthesizer which is quick and easy to sound design on, to tweak and to play with. It also has a bunch of effects which really sort of beefs up the final result coming out of the outputs. Along with ring modulation, modulators, reverb, delays and all that kind of loveliness, there's also an independent overdrive circuit that's always available for turning up the warmth. So the Take 5 is probably the most affordable way into sequential sounds in order to get the gloriousness of those oscillators and that filter and the wonderful control in a compact space for a price which is not too eye-watering. It's a price that's kind of achievable for a decent, high quality, great sounding, no surprises synthesizer. Next up, we've got the Super Gemini from Udo Audio. This is a crazy synthesizer. This is massive. I mean, we know Udo Audio from the Super 6, which was like a Juno-inspired, Roland-inspired synthesizer, where you had everything out on the panel, all the sliders, gorgeously laid out, and then internally you have this extraordinary processor-based digital engine, which is reimagining all of those sounds and all of those controls all the way along, and then fudging you through an analog signal path binaurally, which means you can move it around strangely within the stereo field, and then pumping it out through some fantastic effects. The Super Gemini does that by taking 2 of those, kind of squashing them together, so you get a Juno sandwich. And for that, you've got more voices, you've got more sounds, more modulation, you've got this bitimbral idea again going on, as well as binaural. So you've got sounds going all over the place, you've got layers and stacks and splits, and all the time this extraordinarily high precision models of analog circuitry and fantastic synthesizer sound. The Super Gemini takes the polyphony up to 20 voices in mono, or if you like the whole binaural thing, I don't know really what that means, then for you it's 10 voices, because you've got it all, it has to be moving about within that stereo field. The digitally modelled oscillators kick out all the usual sorts of waveforms, all the ones that we've become familiar with, your sawtooths, your squares, your triangles. But in this one, each voice has 4 oscillators, so it's completely capable, and in fact enjoys very much generating super saws and also super wavetables, because you can stick in wavetables, giving it a whole other range of versatility and of tonal possibilities. But just turning on those super saws, which is a whole stack of sawtooths going at once, is just a gorgeous, gorgeous thing. But once you have your choice of waves in there, you can crossfade, you can morph between different wave shapes, you can cross-modulate and detune, and then all of that oscillation gets split through a pair of filters. They can be high or low pass, and then it all tumbles into chorus and delay effects at the end. So being bitimbral, it does feel very much like you have 2 Super 6s to play with. I mean, in some ways that's enough. I mean, this on this list really should be the Super 6, and in fact previous lists to this I did absolutely go for the Super 6. I think it's a fantastic sounding and playable synthesizer. But the Gemini, just because it puts 2 of these things together, it just takes it to whole other heights, where you can build these enormous sounds, or you can strip it back to have 2 fantastic synthesizers playing kind of side by side. While there are 2 large envelopes for modulation, there's only 1 LFO, which feels a little mean considering the size and possibilities available within it. However, you do have a lot of other expression at your fingertips. The keybed supports full polyphonic aftertouch, which means each note individually will send aftertouch to that note to affect that note, as opposed to affecting the whole sound at once, which is what you get with regular aftertouch. The whole thing is also MPE compatible, so if you have an MPE controller like the Osmos or something from Rolly, then you can stuff that straight in to get all of that pitch changing and movement in all directions all at once. You also have a ribbon controller across the top of the keyboard that you can assign to pretty much any parameter you like. And so perhaps now the single LFO is thinking, well, maybe that's not so bad. Maybe there's plenty in there in order to route modulation and expression to all sorts of different things. I think ultimately the Super Gemini is a player's synth. It's for people who really like and enjoy the playing of a synthesizer as an instrument. I think that will reward you tremendously, and you'll be able to while away the hours just immersed in the awesome sound and the quite unique binaural spread of all of the sounds that are coming out of it. And all of this wonderfulness, of course, comes with a pretty high price tag. And if this is all getting a little bit too pricey for you, then do hang about, because I will be coming up with a budget synth video at some point soon. The Arturia Polybrute 12. Now, a bit like the Super Gemini, where the Super 6 is really perhaps the better keyboard, not the better keyboard, the more concise, cheaper first keyboard. The Polybrute 12 is a similar idea, because the original Polybrute is fantastic, absolutely a fantastic synthesizer. The Polybrute 12 just kind of pushes that out to crazy lengths. So if the Polybrute 12 is too much for you, then do consider the original Polybrute, which is still very much a current keyboard and synthesizer. So the Polybrute 12 is big, chunky, odd looking, expensive, but flipping phenomenal. You've got 12 voice polyphony with 2 analog oscillators per voice and a sub oscillator, noise generator. And the great thing about the oscillators is they let you blend between sounds. But then of course there's pulse width modulation, there's hard sync, but there's also some wavefolding and some FM, and Arturia's own metalizer. Metalizer just makes things sound a bit clangy. It kind of gives an edge to anything. You've got any kind of waveform you like that's feeling very smooth and nice, you turn on the metalizer and it just edges it a bit to give it sort of a ring, a metallic tone, if you like. Now from there, from the oscillations, you can then go through a choice of 2 filters. You've got a ladder filter, like Moog, I suppose, and you've also got this Steiner filter, which is something Arturia have been using a lot on all of their past synthesizers. It comes with drive or brute, with the Steiner filter, where you just dial in the nastiness. Really, I suppose it starts to fatten it, straighten the edges. You know, the Metalizer has given it a glassy, edgy metallic tone, whereas the Brute tends to force it into a bit of overdrive and flatness and fatness. The point being, you turn these things up and try them out and see what you think, and it gives you tonally interesting stuff that's going on. But overdriving through the filter is a fantastic sound. It really does just bring out those overtones and makes it feel so much wider, so much thicker and juicier. It just it does that to the sound. And perhaps where the Super Gemini was lacking in modulation sources, the Polybrute 12 has a ton of the things. You have 3 envelopes and 3 LFOs per voice. So you can do your filter, you can do your amplifier, but then you can also envelope something else. You know, I don't know, like the pitch or the pulse width or the blending between waveforms. And then you've got an LFO which could be moving your cutoff about the place. It could be moving the pitch about for a little bit of vibrato, and then move something else. Keybed is also custom made by Arturia and has polyphonic aftertouch. Again, so that expression going into things is quite extraordinary. We have this strangely wooden ribbon controller on the top and this weirdo wobbly board on the side for very, very expressive playing. The wobbly thing's a bit like the Expressive Touche, I think it's called, which is like it's like a block of wood sitting there that you can wobble and stroke and tap on and move and do expressive things with. So the concept, if you like, of the Polybrute is to give you this enormous sound that you can modulate and push all over the place, but then you can also express yourself through. So it's inviting you in very much to play into the heart of this synthesizer. It's not going to be content with just running a sequence or running an arpeggiator. It wants you to involve yourself in the sound that's coming out. Once again, the Polybrute 12 is by timbral. Seems to be the thing. Definitely the thing of the season is to be by timbral. So you can split off the voices and create 2 entire synthesizers, which you can treat differently or layered, split, you know, however you want to do it. It has some fantastically complex arpeggiation, and also the sequencer allows for 3 channels of automation recording. So a bit like the Moog Muse, but that was, I think, up to 8. Whereas on the Polybrute 12 you have 3 channels, but which is probably plenty, but it does give you that space in order to automate things through the sequence, so it's not just running a bunch of notes, you're running a bunch of other stuff too. The Polybrute 12 sits between the Muse and the Gemini, Super Gemini, sort of sits between those 2 in terms of pricing. And those 3, I guess, are the big hitters. They're the big flagship synthesizers. I mean, if you wanted a center of your studio, then the Muse, the Gemini, the Polybrute 12, those really, I think, are the most extraordinary choices for the most extraordinary synthesizers. The other ones, more that we're going to get to in a minute, and the Take 5, they sit around in different areas. But the top 3, I think, if you want a massive, extraordinary lifestyle synthesizer, then those are definitely the ones. So moving on to other things then, like the Take 5, we have the Oberheim TEO 5. It looks similar. I mean, it's kind of built in the same factory, isn't it? I mean, let's be honest with it, because Oberheim and Sequential have worked a lot together. There's been a lot of cross-modulation, there's been a lot of work and collaboration going on, and really the TEO 5 is kind of doing the Take 5, but in an Oberheim style. Now, what I like about the Take 5, you will also find in the TEO 5. And is it fair that both of these appear on this list? Well, yes and no. I mean, the Take 5, what's beautiful about it is that it is a way of getting into the sequential sound for a lot less money than having to buy a Prophet 5 or one of their other larger synthesizers. So for that, you get, I think, a very traditional, a very straightforward synthesizer experience. And the TEO 5 does something similar, but it does it differently. It does it differently enough to give it a proper Oberheim character and a sense that you are entering into a slightly different world. And it just does it so well that I can't seem to find a way to bump it off the list. It has to be here, simply because it's just a really nice take from Oberheim, because Oberheim have previously released the OBX. You know, once Oberheim brought themselves back to life again, God bless them, the OBX 8 was the thing. I mean, it encapsulated the best of Oberheim and stuck it in this massive synthesizer that sounded like all of the historical vintage Oberheim synthesizers. This doesn't. This goes somewhere else. And that's important, because we can't all just be looking and re-putting the past back into the future all the time. We have to take what's good, but then bring that into something new and something more modern. I think the TO5 does that. So compact again, 44 keys, same sort of size and shape that's actually going to fit on your desktop. You don't have to buy a brand new stand for it or build a new house. It's going to fit. And then from the oscillator point of view, you've got 2 per voice, simple, straightforward, exactly kind of what you expect them to be. But within these oscillators, they have a focus on detuning to give you that gooey sort of chorusing sound. And then, unexpectedly, for Oberheim, they have cross-modulation where you can use one oscillator to FM into the other oscillator to give you suddenly a range of twangy, clangy FM sounds. And then once you've played around with your waveforms and bits and pieces, it then goes through a classic SEM filter. So perhaps on the Take 5 where you get that, you know, because the filter really does define the sound of a synthesizer to a great degree. And so on the Take 5 you're getting this profit defined synthesizer. On the TO5 you're getting an Oberheim SEM designed sound through that filter. And it's a 12 dB per octave filter. It's not going to scream at you. It's just going to give you juicy, fat, warm, lovely, cuddly sounds all the way through. Another place where TO5 tends to excel is in the modulation. There's 19 slots for modulators. LFOs, you've got 1 global, 1 per voice, 2 envelopes, and they can all be redirected wherever you like. The envelopes will loop and cycle at you. And you can also bring in the sequencer and the arpeggiator into modulation duties for up to 64 different destinations. So once you get into the engine of the TO5, you can craft and modulate and start pushing the boundaries of what you could possibly do with synthesis. It really is very interesting and surprisingly deep for something which on the surface looks like you know exactly what it is that you can do with it. Another key element is the vintage knob. This is something we've seen on some other synthesizers, but it's particularly key in this one because it's going to bring in a level of instability that in a digitally controlled synthesizer environment that you have in the TO5 is going to add so much more sense of history, sense of legacy, sense of past glories into this compact little synthesizer. Another one from Arturia, this is the Minifreak. This is, I think, potentially one of the most interesting synthesizers to come out for, well, I don't know, the last 10 years. Maybe. Interesting because it takes ideas from modular synthesis, takes those ideas and puts them into a polyphonic synthesizer. So this is all digital stuff. We're not trying to make pretense at any kind of analog oscillators or anything like that. These are digital engines and algorithms that are taken from things like the Mutable Instruments Platts. Those algorithms, which you would normally play monophonically within a modular context, you know, bleeps and bloops and sequences and stuff going through, those oscillators are now suddenly available to play on a keyboard. That's interesting. So it's a graphical interface and a little display. You can start to get a feel for how these things work. Because if nothing else, the algorithms on the Platts are a bit mind-boggling. It's like, what are we doing? We've got these knobs that do stuff. What is it doing exactly? Changes seemingly with every one. Whereas with the display, you're really kept in the loop as to what's going on and you have a much clearer idea of how you are affecting change and what those changes are doing as you do it. The sounds are not going to be like anything else you've heard because they are weird and strange. There's harmonic sounds, there's carpless strings, there's virtual analog, sure, but there's chords and speech and strange noise-related glitch percussive things. And there are more algorithms than that. There's some from noise engineering and other places which have been brought in to give you super saws and crazy stuff and weird glitchy wobbly blibbly blitz over here. The source of sound is a place of endless fascination. You can just stay purely within that environment and have a fabulous synthesizer strange time. But there's a lot more to it than that. This is an entire synthesizer. It's not just about the voices. From there, you can pull whatever voice you like through a rather nice analog filter, which gives a lot of play, a lot of self-oscillation through the pushing of resonance, and a lot of bite and brute through this Arturia filter. The envelopes and modulators are similarly odd and strange, with some traditional stuff going on and then some more sort of West Coast looping envelope kind of stuff going on. And you have this little matrix at the top left with which you can allocate everything to everything else. So you get a lot of scope and versatility in what actually is controlling what within the context of your patch. So you end up with a choice of, I think it's 22 very unconventional sounds being pushed and pulled through a modulation matrix, sculpted through a filter, enveloped, looped and LFO'd and modulated, and then put through a keyboard which is small and compact, very little playable, with a crazy sequencer, an arpeggiator, and all sorts of interesting dice and randomization things that pour themselves into the performance element of it. It's a heck of a lot of fun to play with, and that's as important as anything else. I mean, this is a $600 synthesizer. There's no way it's going to sound like the Muse or the Gemini or the TO5 or anything like that. This sounds different, but the way that it does that means that it fits differently into your music. You can use it in all sorts of places. It's incredibly versatile, and while it can do paddy sounds, lead sounds, bass sounds, all those sorts of synthesizer sounds with its virtual analog oscillators, it can just do so much more than that. That's why it's fascinating. It really is interesting. They also do a complete software version that you can load up in your DAW, so you can actually sculpt in software and go between the two. Funny enough, they do that with the Polybrute 12 too. But it is a really useful two-way pathway of using it differently. Now you may have noticed that all of the synthesizers so far have been polyphonic. Well, because that's the feel of synthesizers. Big synthesizers, big polyphonic sounds. You know, we like that. However, there's still something to be said, very much, for the monophonic. And the one monophonic in this list this time is this one, the Pittsburgh Modular Taiga keyboard. It's also a desktop unit, but the keyboard in particular I really, really like. It's funny looking. It's funny looking, but also beautiful. It's designed very much to hit, I think, those points of being a vintage feel of a synthesizer, with those wooden cheeks and the size and shape of it, the rakish angle of the front panel. All of that harks back to classic days of synthesizers. And then you get a slap in the face with all these sort of strangely colourful knobs. So the look is not for everyone. But, you know, if you enjoy life and you smile occasionally, then the colour scheme for it and the feel and sizing of those knobs is going to be, you know, quite a nice thing, I think. So what is it? Well, it's essentially a mini Moog, but done in the Pittsburgh modular way, which means they kind of turn everything upside down and fold it in half and stretch it about the place and make it do weird stuff. That's what this is. So it's analog through and through, but there is a bit of a digital control engine built in there for a little bit of extra stuff, like the arpeggiation and other multi-function modulators and bits and pieces. That's just a side quest. The main focus is 3 fabulous sounding analog VCOs, and these have multiple wave shapes, and the wave shapes are interesting because they morph from one to another. So rather than just having one wave and another wave and another one, you have sort of like halfway between these waves and then somewhere else between these waves. So you can use regular waveforms, or you can morph between different ones, and each oscillator can have its own waveform doing its own thing. So you can absolutely dial in some super sawtooths, or you can put in some square waves and detune them slightly, or you can just have each one playing something different. Or you can use one oscillator and stuff the other 2 in it as some kind of cross-modulation nightmare, or use 2 oscillators and use a third one as a modulator into doing some other form of pushing and pulling stuff around. But once you have those basic waveforms doing what you want them to do, you can then fold them 6 times in order to generate completely different competing tones. And those, of course, can be modulated, can be LFO'd, or can be enveloped to change whenever you like. So right from the go, It may only be one note at a time, but you have a heck of a lot going on. The sweeping between different sounds, waveforms coming and going, coming into life, being born, living their lives, and then dying and dissipating over here. Quite extraordinary range of tones available right in the oscillators to start with. Then, once you've mixed those together to your delight, added some noise, perhaps if you fancy that in there a little bit, it then all sort of waterfalls itself into the filter. Now this is the Pittsburgh modular filter. It's quite a thing. It's sort of, the way you can only describe it is that it's good like all the way round. It sounds good no matter where you put it. With most filters you're kind of trying to find that little sweet spot. Oh yeah, about there is nice. With this, it's just all sweet spots. So it's always sounding good. There's no drop off or anything when you increase the resonance. The resonance just brings in this bit of chaos that just starts to bring in around the end, this ringing, and then it just dissolves into complete self-oscillating gorgeousness. So you've got all that going on. But then they're not finished. At that point, it tips into the dynamic center. Now this is a little bit confusing if you're used to more regular subtractive synthesizers, but it has at the end something which can be a VCA quite straightforwardly, but it also can be a low pass gate and a strange sort of striking low pass, ringing, longer low pass gate. Low pass gate being the idea that you sort of trigger light which then fades, and it's that gives it a very organic sound. But with Pittsburgh they can extend upon that to give it a longer sound, a more versatile sound, a more dynamic sound. So you end up having something which can sound very organic and yet is still maintaining its level of artificial synthesis. Fascinating. There's a lot going on. There's a whole row of patch points at the top, so the whole thing can be modular. You can get into every single part of it singularly as a separate entity, a separate circuit, and modulate that or address it separately within different things. It's even got a bay over here for extra Eurorack modules if you so wish. It's quite an amazing piece of work, this synthesizer. So if you've been thinking about something like a mini Moog or something which is really going to form an interesting sound in your studio which is going to cut through everything else, definitely consider this. Yeah, you're not going to be doing big pads or big chords or nothing, but you can do extraordinary lead sounds, bass sounds, effects, craziness, different tones. You can layer it up, build it up however you like. It's quite an extraordinary synthesizer. Lastly, we have the Mantis. The Mantis from PWM. This is really interesting. It's a strange looker. I'm not in love with how it looks, I have to say. Similarly with the Malevolent, their first synthesizer, which was great. It was like an angry little git. It would sort of spit and growl at you, which, you know, in terms of synthesis, we quite like that sometimes. Mantis feels and follows a similar idea. Now, the oscillators are designed by the late Chris Huggett and come sort of directly evolved from synthesizers like the Wasp and the Oscar, which he also designed many years ago. And the Mantis feels like the fulfillment of those ideas. It's dragging those edgy, crazy British Oxford oscillators into the modern world and giving them the space to really flourish and to find their feet. It started off as a kind of a monosynth and then sort of grew into a duophonic thing, and I think at the moment it can now pull off about 4 voices. There was some doubt about that. I don't know how these things work, but apparently over time the coding within it and the working of it together has managed to eke out 4 whole paraphonic voices, and each one, I think, getting 2 oscillators and a sub-oscillator. Or it might well be that you've got the duophonic with 2 oscillators per voice and then using those 4 oscillators polyphonically perhaps in order to get those 4 voices going. You know, I'm not entirely sure about that. Well, I'm hoping to get one in to review it, so I'll be able to tell you all about it once I do. But anyway, within these oscillators you can push and pull and drift them apart from each other in order to keep the detuning sort of moving in some kind of gloriously gooey motion. You've then got 2 state variable filters, state variable being sort of SEM-like filters, I suppose, which can be put in series or parallel, so you can drive either sort of two filters together, so you can move those peaks around in a more of a band pass kind of interesting throbbing kind of way, or you can just stick them in series, so you can move filter with one then filter with the other in any form of mode that you could possibly desire. This gives lots of scope for bandpass formant sounds, notch sounds, comb filtering, that kind of thing. Sort of the more edgy, different stuff that you usually have to work really hard to achieve. This has got all of that served up directly to you. You also have a pair of LFOs in there for modulating stuff about, a pair of loopable envelopes, of course, for doing the same, or for enveloping your amplifier and your filter. You'll also find that you can squish things together into remodulation and add glide. For a bit of fun, there's an arpeggiator in there with a fantastic swing facility, and also a lot of control on a joystick to turn things on and off and to add a little bit of modulation or difference in what it is that you're doing. And finally at the end you've got some reverb and some chorus just to add to the lushness. Now overall the Mantis, I think, is a bit of a strange fish. It's going to lead you in different directions and work slightly differently to other things that you're expecting. But that is another reason why I really like this synthesizer, because it's going to pull you in slightly different directions. So you're not going to just be repeating yourself and doing the same thing over and over. Because what perhaps you'll find in the big flagship synthesizers is that you're going to be pulled down a very similar and familiar and cuddly road. I mean, that's good, that's great. It's good to be in a place where you understand what's going on, because then you can really release your creativity, on the one hand. Whereas in something like the Mantis, very much also in the Minifreak, is that it forces you to work differently. And that, I think, triggers different creative muscles within us, or exercises them a little bit that perhaps you haven't thought about before, pushes you in different directions, brings in a different tone, a different edginess and a level of character that perhaps these other synths don't have. So while you may well lovingly rest and drown in the gorgeousness of the fantastic big synthesizers, this one will keep you awake at night, because you're going to be farting around with it, trying to keep pushing that sound and finding that sound and finding that other sound. It's going to reward the exploration, and it's going to give you a sound that nobody else has. That, I think, is what's most interesting about the Mantis. So there you are, that's 8 synthesizers. 8 synthesizers, I think, at the moment, in the middle of 2024, are pretty phenomenal. 3 flagship synthesizers, big, fat, expensive, many thousands of dollars. 2 mid synthesizers in the Take 5 and the TO5, which I think you could say they're interchangeable. Could you? No, I mean, I think they sound very different. I think they have different intentions. I think the Take 5 is the warmth and familiar sound of a Prophet, whereas the TO5 is taking that Oberheim sound and twisting it and trying to give you a different place to go with it. Those two things I think are very, very valid, and that's why it sits there. And then we have 2 weirdos in the Minifreak and the Mantis, which are going to give you a very different experience, a very different tone, a very different way to approach synthesis. And finally, the Taiga, which is just fantastic. It's so much fun to play on, and it will just keep you endlessly entertained while finding the fattest, juiciest 3 oscillator monophonic sounds you could possibly believe. I had another thought while I was editing this video down, and I decided that I completely missed something out that's quite important, that's very different, that brings a whole reversal and transpositional characterization of what synthesis is all about. The Solar 42 from Elta Music is an extraordinarily beautiful, innovative, and yet ancient machine. It seems to drag in the power of our ancestors and shakes our bones and cuddles our hearts and just takes us to another completely entire plane. I have no idea why I didn't think of this before, but it absolutely deserves to be on this list. I think I've included it in other synthesizer lists before because it has a particular uniqueness to it, which tends to mean that it doesn't necessarily sit that well alongside your other keyboard synthesizers. This is described as being an ambient drone machine. It's a machine that will generate through many oscillators, generate fixed sounds that then start to to interfere, to change, to beat, to detune, to find chordal structures and harmonics, and then move away into microtonal dissonance and bizarreness. These drones will fill an entire space, but then it also can introduce melodic tones. Amongst the multiple drones of voices, there are also a couple of voices that you can empower with the ability to create different notes and textures and movement. So within your bedrock of cinematic bubbling, you can then have this powerful lead or bass or motif or some other bits and pieces going through and running through and changing what's going on. The original one that SE Music made, the Solar 50, which had 50 oscillators, was somehow overwhelming in of itself. It would fold in on itself in the amount of droning that it would do, and it would lose all sense of being able to find or grab or grasp musical content. And that is a thing in of itself, I think. But what they did in evolving it and changing it into the 42 is that they brought a sense of clarity. It's like it was stuck somewhere out in the mist and the fog, and they've just brought it to light. Not enough so that it loses its texture and its soundscape and its ability to disappear. No, not at all. But they've brought it into the light enough so that mere mortals like myself can play and interact and start to generate, because it's a synthesizer of generation. You start off with these multiple voices of drones, and you can create chords, you can create textures, you can create movement with those, you can create sequences with those, and then you can pump them through a pair of old Russian Polyvoc filters, and that gives it an edge, that gives it a certain something. And then with these melodic voices starting to come in, arpeggiations, you've got this touch keyboard with which you can start to manipulate and change and move things about. You have joysticks in which you can start to modulate and move stuff. And then it all kind of swirls and centers around this portal in the middle, this cartridge system into which you can plug different effects that can take it into a wash of spacey reverb, or modulate it into some kind of chorus, or throwing, spinning, flanging, moving form of audio destruction. It's a beautiful machine. All of the demos I've seen of people using it, it just ends up in this heavenly state of euphoric, ambient worship. It's quite a thing. Yeah, I think I really like it. I would love to have a go sometime. But it sounds amazing, looks amazing. It's not like this. You have lots and lots of knobs to play with, lots of compartmentalized different bits with different voices that you're interacting with. All sorts of routings you can do, a bit of modular patching in there too. It's quite an extraordinary thing, and to watch people use it is an education, I think, in sonic exploration, as opposed to just going to play a synthesizer. And that's why it needs to be in this list, because it's a synthesizer absolutely through to its core, but it's got such a different approach and will pull you on a completely different journey that it definitely stands out all by itself. So maybe if we were to shift the Take 5 and TO5 into a similar space, then that would leave us room within our 8 synthesizers for the Solar 42. Because it absolutely deserves to be there. Now, of course, there's a danger here of me going, oh no, but then there's this other synth, and then there's this other synth, and then this other synth. And you, I'm sure, will be shouting at the screen going, no, you've forgotten my favourite synth. But, well, we have to face up to the fact that this is the definitive list. It's the only list you're ever going to need. And there can never be any slightest possibility that I could probably be wrong about any of it. No way. But if you've got strong feelings about a synth in particular, then stick it in the comments, let me know. But otherwise, just gonna have to take my word for it. This is the best you can get. There you go. I hope that was helpful. There's so many synthesizers around at the moment. I'm sure when I redo this video in about 6 months' time, it'll be completely different. But until then, go and make some tunes.